My sister thought I was there to apply for a job. I didn't correct her. She said it lightly, like it was obvious, like there was no other reason I could be standing in that room. A few people glanced in my direction, waiting for me to confirm it or correct it. I didn't do either. I just walked past her and took my seat at the head of the table. That was when the room shifted, though not all at once. But it didn't start there. My name is Charlotte Bennett. I am 34 years old. The day before my sister's engagement party, I drove to my parents' house with a wrapped gift on the passenger seat and a suit folded in the back. I had planned to arrive early, help with whatever needed to be done, and stay out of the way I usually did. My father was already in the kitchen when I walked in. He didn't ask how I had been or why I came early. He just said we needed to talk before tomorrow. I set the gift down on the counter and waited. He explained that the engagement was not only a family event. There would be conversations about a shared investment structure between our family and my sister's fiancé's family. It was important, he said, that everything appeared stable and consistent. This isn't a small arrangement, he said. We're talking about several $1 million being consolidated into one structure. People will be asking who's involved, who's responsible. He looked at me a little longer. And I don't have clear answers when it comes to you. Then he looked at me and said, "You're not coming. I'm not explaining you." For a moment, I thought I had misunderstood him. "I'm not coming," I asked. He picked up his cup, steady, like the answer was already final. It's not the right setting. Behind him, my mother kept folding napkins, one after another, each one lined up with the last. She didn't look up. From the hallway, my sister's voice carried in. "Dad's right. It's just one night. Don't make it into something else." I stood there with my hand still resting on the edge of the counter. "So I don't exist tomorrow?" I said. No one answered. That was when I understood it wasn't about the dinner. It was about what I represented in a room where everything was being measured. I nodded once. Understood. I didn't argue. I didn't explain anything. I just turned and left the way I came in, the gift still sitting on the counter behind me. Less than 72 hours later, my sister would walk into my company, look at me, and laugh like she already knew exactly who I was. It wasn't the first time I had been placed somewhere without being asked. That night in the kitchen only made it visible. For years, the difference between my sister and me had been explained in ways that sounded reasonable on the surface. Claire chose a path that made sense to people like my father. She stayed in finance, moved steadily, learned how to present herself in a way that made others feel certain about what they were seeing. She didn't create questions. I did. I left a structured role when I was supposed to stay in it. I built something that didn't have a clear shape in the beginning, something that required time before it made sense even to me. By the time it started working, the version of me my family had settled on was already in place. It was a position my father had helped me secure, and I left before it made sense to anyone else. It became easier for them to keep that version than to update it. My father never said it directly before, but I could see how he organized things when it mattered. He spoke about continuity, about protecting what had been built, about making sure the next step looked stable to the people who would be involved. My sister fit into that structure without friction. I didn't. The engagement wasn't just a family event. It was where he was aligning two families around shared assets, future decisions, and control. In that setting, there wasn't space for uncertainty, or for someone who required explanation. And I was someone who required explanation. I understood then that I wasn't being overlooked or misjudged. Nothing about it was accidental. I had been placed outside of something deliberate, something designed to function without me. Once I saw it that way, it became harder to take it personally. It wasn't about whether they valued me. It was about whether I fit into what they were trying to build. And I didn't. I didn't wait for the feeling to settle before I acted. When I got back to my apartment, I sat at my desk and opened the list of things I had been handling for my parents without much thought. a contractor invoice I had agreed to cover for the kitchen renovation, a set of financial documents my father had asked me to review before moving money into a new account. Small things, taken together, that kept me quietly involved. I sent 2 emails and 1 message. The first confirmed that I would no longer be covering the remaining balance on the renovation, which was just over $28,000. The second declined further review of any financial transfers or documents. The message to my mother was shorter. I told her I wouldn't be available to help with anything related to the engagement or after. She called a few minutes later. "Is this about what your father said?" "It's about what it means," I said. There was a pause on the line, long enough for both of us to understand that nothing I added would change it. I ended the call first. For a moment. I almost called back to soften what I had said. It would have been easier to adjust it, to make it less final. I didn't explain my decisions to anyone else. I didn't soften them or leave space for negotiation. I just stopped participating in the parts of their lives where I had been useful but not included. If I had to be explained, I had already been reduced. By the time my father decided I didn't belong in that room, I had already built something that would have fit there. I started the company 3 years earlier, after leaving a role that made sense to everyone except me. The first year was uneven. I made decisions without enough information, trusted the wrong timelines, and lost more money than I expected. There were months when keeping the company running meant delaying my own salary and negotiating payments 1 invoice at a time. The second year stabilized. We refined the model, focused on a narrower set of clients, and built systems that actually held under pressure. By the third year, we weren't guessing anymore. We were delivering results that companies could measure, and that meant they started staying. By that point, we were managing contracts worth over $2 million annually, with clients across multiple states. We had already turned down 1 acquisition offer because it didn't align with where I wanted the company to go. We had just crossed a point where expansion made sense. Not fast, not careless, but deliberate. A second office was already being discussed, and a partnership with a financial firm in Boston was moving toward final terms. It was the kind of step that changes how a company is seen. No one in my family knew the details. They had asked how work was going, but never in a way that left space for an answer beyond fine. I stopped trying to turn those moments into something more. They never asked a question that required a real answer. So I built everything without them, and eventually, I stopped expecting them to see it. The engagement party happened without me, exactly the way they had planned it. Later that evening, the photos started appearing online. My sister stood at the center in every frame. My parents close beside her. Everyone arranged in a way that looked deliberate rather than natural. The setting was formal, the lighting soft, the kind of atmosphere that suggests nothing has ever been out of place. The caption mentioned family, stability, and the future they were building together. I scrolled through a few of them without stopping on any single image for long. A message came in from a relative I hadn't spoken to in months. "Everything finally looks the way it should." I read it once, then set my phone down for a moment before picking it back up again. There wasn't anything in the photos that felt unfamiliar. If anything, they confirmed something I had already understood the day before. I opened the family group chat, muted it, then removed myself from it entirely. After that, I went through my notifications and turned off anything connected to them. I didn't feel a sharp reaction, just a quiet shift. It wasn't a decision I had to think through. It just felt like the next step in something that had already been decided. Monday morning started the way most of them did, with a full calendar and a list of decisions that needed to be made without delay. I was reviewing the agenda for the partnership meeting when I saw her name, Claire Bennett, finance manager. It was listed alongside 2 senior associates from her firm, positioned in a way that suggested she would be involved in the discussion, not just observing it. I read the document again, slower this time, to make sure I hadn't misunderstood anything. I sat there for a few seconds longer than I needed to. Not because I didn't know what to do, but because I knew exactly how that room was going to feel the moment I walked into it. The firm itself wasn't a surprise. We had been in talks with them for weeks, moving carefully through projections, compliance, and long-term alignment. They were the right partner for what we were building. I just hadn't expected my sister to be part of it. For a moment, I considered adjusting the meeting. I could have reassigned it to someone else on my team, or delayed it until her role was clarified. There were reasonable ways to do it that wouldn't raise questions. I didn't take any of them. I had spent enough time adjusting myself to fit other people's expectations. I wasn't going to start adjusting reality to make them comfortable. Instead, I confirmed the meeting as scheduled and continued reviewing the materials. By the time I closed the file, the decision had already settled into something simple. Whatever was going to happen next would happen in the open, without any effort to manage how it looked. When I walked into the conference room, she noticed me immediately. Claire was standing near the table with two colleagues. Mid-conversation, her posture relaxed in a way that suggested she already understood her place in the room. She looked at me, paused just long enough to recognize me, and then smiled. "What are you doing here?" she said, glancing briefly at the folder in my hand. "Are you applying for something?" It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. The people around her heard it clearly enough to shift their attention in my direction, waiting for context. I didn't answer her. For a second, I stood still, not because I didn't know what to do, but because I recognized the pattern. This was how she had always handled me, by defining the situation before I had a chance to exist in it. I remember thinking how easily people rely on old versions of you, especially when those versions have always worked in their favor. Then I walked past her. I moved to the head of the table, set my notes down, and adjusted the chair slightly before sitting. The motion itself was ordinary, something I had done in that room many times, but the effect was different now. The conversation behind me stopped. No one asked for clarification. One of my team members, Daniel, who had been reviewing documents near the screen, glanced at me briefly, then at the others, and straightened his posture as if something had just aligned into place. Claire didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. The room was already beginning to correct her. I settled into the chair at the head of the table and opened my folder without looking up. It was a small movement, something I had done dozens of times before, but the room adjusted around it. Daniel stepped forward and connected his laptop to the screen, pulling up the presentation we had reviewed earlier that morning. No one asked where I should sit. No one hesitated. "Let's begin," he said, then added, "Clara will lead us through the agenda." He didn't emphasize my name. He didn't need to. I glanced across the table briefly, just enough to see the shift take hold. The two senior associates from Claire's firm straightened in their seats, their attention moving toward me in a way that was practiced and immediate. One of them gave a short nod, acknowledging the structure of the meeting without comment. Claire hadn't moved. "Wait, you're leading this," Claire said, her voice lower now. "Yes," I said. She was still standing near the side of the table, her expression caught somewhere between recognition and resistance, as if she was trying to place me back into the version of the situation that had made sense a moment earlier. Then she sat down, slower than the others. I noticed that she didn't look at me directly after that. Not right away, which told me more than anything she could have said. We moved into the first section without pause. I outlined the objectives, the scope of the partnership, and the expectations around implementation. The numbers were clear, the projections grounded, and the structure consistent with everything we had discussed in earlier calls. No one interrupted. When a question came from one of the associates, it was directed to me. I answered it the same way I would have any other day, without adjusting my tone or adding anything extra to the explanation. There was no moment where I explained who I was. There didn't need to be. By the time we reached the second half of the meeting, the room had settled into a new alignment, one that didn't leave space for the assumption Claire had made when I walked in, and she knew it. The meeting continued without interruption, and by the time we reached the final section, the structure had already settled into something clear. We reviewed the financial projections in detail, moving through revenue expectations, operational costs, and the timeline for scaling across the next 2 quarters. The numbers held under scrutiny, which mattered more than anything else in that room. After that, we shifted to internal processes, focusing on communication standards and how each side would handle client-facing responsibilities. Nothing about the discussion required adjustment. What stood out came from the documentation we had already compiled. As part of our internal review, my team had included notes from previous interactions with the firm, along with feedback that had been recorded over time. It wasn't unusual. We did that with every partner. Claire's name appeared more than once. The pattern was consistent. Dismissive communication, missed follow-ups, decisions made without alignment. None of it was dramatic on its own. But together, it formed something that couldn't be ignored in a long-term partnership. I didn't address it in the room. There was no need to turn it into a discussion. If something is already documented, it doesn't need to be argued. It just needs to be acknowledged in the decisions that follow. After the meeting ended, I stayed back with Daniel and our operations lead, Melissa, to finalize the terms. We reviewed each condition carefully, making sure everything reflected the standards we had already established. One of those conditions was role-specific. Certain individuals would not be assigned to manage our account. Claire was included in that group. The language we used was neutral and precise, referencing consistency, communication, and alignment with client expectations. It didn't mention anything personal. It didn't need to. The document was sent that afternoon. Their response came before the end of the day. They acknowledged the condition and confirmed that Claire would be reassigned internally, effective immediately, and removed from all client-facing responsibilities related to our account. I knew what that meant in practice. It wasn't termination. It was a shift away from visibility, from decision-making, from the kind of work that leads to advancement. Nothing about it felt like retaliation. I later learned that the reassignment affected more than just one account. Her performance review reflected the same concerns, and a promotion she had been considered for was no longer being discussed. People started being more careful around her after that. Not openly, but enough that it changed how she moved in the office. It was just the result of a system working the way it was designed to. My father called that evening. His voice was measured, like he had spent time deciding how to approach the conversation without reopening what had already been said. He told me they hadn't understood the situation, that things had been misinterpreted, that I should have explained more clearly what I was building. "We're proud of you," he said. "This didn't need to happen like this." I let him finish before I answered. "You decided who I was before you asked," I said. There was a pause on the line. Not long, but long enough to make it clear he didn't have a response that would change anything. I also heard that the discussion with the other family didn't go the way he expected. There were questions about internal alignment, and for the first time, he wasn't the one controlling how the situation was understood. It was the first time I had seen him in a position where his certainty didn't carry the same weight. My mother reached out the next day. She suggested dinner, something quiet, just the three of us, as if the setting itself could reset the terms of the relationship. I didn't refuse immediately. I thought about it longer than I expected to. I was used to leaving space for things to return to what they had been, even when I knew they wouldn't. In the end, I told her I needed things to stay the way they were for now. Not out of anger, but because going back without changing anything would mean accepting the same place again. I didn't rejoin their conversations. I didn't resume the financial support I had quietly provided for years. I stayed where I was, without adjusting it to make anyone else more comfortable. Over the next few weeks, I heard about Claire indirectly. She had been reassigned, moved off several accounts, including ones that would have positioned her for advancement. It wasn't presented as a consequence, just a structural change within the firm. At work, things continued forward. The partnership closed. We expanded carefully, adding people where it made sense, not where it looked impressive. One evening, I stayed late after everyone had left. The office was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't ask anything from you. The city outside moved at its own pace, steady and distant. My phone sat on the desk beside me, still and silent. It used to mean something when no one called. Now it didn't. I stood there for a while, not thinking about what had happened as much as noticing what had changed. I didn't feel the need to explain myself anymore. I didn't feel the need to correct anyone's version of me, if there was anything I understood at that point. It was this: if you spend too long trying to fit into a place that requires you to shrink, you stop recognizing what you've actually built. Sometimes the only way to keep it is to step out of that place completely. If you've ever been put in a position where you had to choose between being accepted and being accurate about who you are, I didn't realize how much of myself I had been adjusting until I stopped doing it. For the first time, nothing behind me had any say in what came next.